Well, youth crime is on the rise, according to the latest data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. A snapshot of the last 15 years shows the number of 10 to 17-year-olds being dealt with by police has been going down, but that trend changed in the last financial year, with the rate of children and teenagers being arrested increasing 6% in the year 22-23. Professor Terry Goldsworthy is a criminologist from Bond University. He was a policeman for almost 30 years and he joins us now. Professor Goldsworthy, welcome.
Yeah, good afternoon.
So these numbers suggest there are less offenders, but those offenders are offending more often. Is that right?
Yeah, what we've got here is there's two sets of data that really relate to offending in terms of youth. And one is what we call the unique offender rate. And we've seen an uptick in the unique offenders. So the ABS data, when looking at youth offenders and the rate, they only count a youth once. They enter the justice system in that 12-month period. So you could have an offender who gets arrested 12 times, they'll only be counted once. That unique rate has risen in the last financial year. And we've also seen increases in most states in terms of indicators of recidivism. So it really mirrors, for instance, I'm based in Queensland. In Queensland, we know that the latest crime report came out about 2 weeks ago, and it tells us that in 2021-22, 22-23, we know that the number of unique offenders rose by 5% in Queensland, and the number of times youth offenders were proceeded against by police increased about 9%. So the state trends are reflected in reality by the national trends.
How do we tackle the issue of youth crime and particularly reoffending? Do we need to consider these as two different areas?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, most youth offenders will go on to move out of the youth justice system on their first interaction, etc. Where we're seeing the problems is in relation to hardcore youth offending. And to use the Queensland example, we call them serious repeat offenders now. And that is a declaration that is made by the courts based on evidence of past offending history, bail applications, breaches of bail, etc. And we know that we've got about 480 or so hardcore offenders in Queensland. And they are responsible, they make up about 20% or thereabouts of youth offenders, and they're responsible for 50% of the crime. So within the youth offending, there's some really important kind of issues to identify, and one is the offending by youth offenders. The second is the types of offences that are being committed by these hardcore youth offenders, and they're things like, in Queensland, for instance, youth offenders make up 18% or thereabouts of all offenders as a proportion. Yet when we look at break and enters, stealing vehicles, robberies, etc., youth offenders make up around 55% of those offences. So they're offending in much more serious offences than a greater rate in proportion than their overall numbers would indicate.
And on the other side of the ledger, I suppose, what do we need to do to tackle that, Professor Goldsworthy? What do we know works in reducing youth reoffending?
Yeah, well, there's a number of things we need to consider. There's three aspects of youth crime. One is pre-crime, the crime, and then what happens post-crime. We know that youth offenders, from data from the Youth Justice Department, tells us that about 38% of them in Queensland had used methamphetamine. Youth offenders are usually disengaged from the education system. They are often exposed to DV in the household, and we know they're suffering to a large extent, about 40% or thereabouts, from a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental or cognitive issue. So those things need to be addressed. And look, they're not easy to address. They require large amounts of resource. They're quite expensive to address. But if you address those issues before a child gets into the criminal stage, you're going to be much more successful in terms of prevention. We've seen a lot of focus on bail laws and, sentencing of juveniles, etc. I guess that's the community safety aspect, the other side, that we often hear about in terms of when a hardcore offender is out there on an offending spree. And yes, we do need to keep the community safe, and that's why those bail laws be tightened up. Once the child's been sentenced, that's the post-crime area, where we need to look at rehabilitation programs that are available to offenders so that they can move out of the offending cycle. And you're only going to do by that if they've got sufficient education, sufficient support in the community and sufficient job skills to go and get a job and be a productive member of the community. If we're not doing those things at either end and in the middle, then we have our problematic aspects as we do in our criminal justice system.
Professor Goldsworthy, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
That was Professor Terry Goldsworthy from Bond University. Well, since the start of this month, Sydney and other